The forests of the Ardennes lay buried under fresh snow as December 1944 drew near its midpoint, presenting an image of tranquility that masked the fury about to be unleashed. German forces had been assembling in secret, gathering strength for what their high command envisioned as a decisive strike that might alter the trajectory of the entire war. The Nazi leader had ordered this massive counter-offensive, later remembered as the Battle of the Bulge, with objectives that bordered on fantasy: fracture the Allied front, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and compel the Western powers to negotiate terms favourable to the crumbling Reich. The American troops holding positions in this sector had every reason to believe they were stationed in a backwater, a quiet zone where exhausted divisions could rest and green replacements could acclimate to frontline conditions without facing immediate danger. None of them imagined that within a matter of hours they would find themselves staring down some of the most fearsome mechanized warfare machines Germany had managed to assemble in the waning months of the conflict. What the Germans had planned represented audacity of the highest order, perhaps even crossing into recklessness when examined with clear eyes. Over 200,000 soldiers, accompanied by close to 1,000 tanks and assault guns, were poised to surge through the dense woodland. Among them marched elite units, including the 5th Panzer Army and the 6th Panzer Army under SS leadership, formations tasked with smashing through the American lines that had been stretched dangerously thin across this supposedly peaceful front. Within their ranks rumbled armoured monsters like the Panther and the massive Tiger II, vehicles protected by frontal armour plates measuring up to 150 mm in thickness, far exceeding what the majority of Allied anti-tank weapons had been engineered to defeat. German strategists placed their faith in this steel avalanche, convinced that the combination of complete surprise, brutal winter conditions, and overwhelming armoured superiority would deliver the rapid breakthrough they desperately needed. The American defenders found themselves in a precarious position. Units occupying the Ardennes sector included many inexperienced soldiers alongside veterans recovering from earlier battles, and the defensive line had been extended to cover more ground than prudent military doctrine would normally allow. Supplies ran short, morale wavered, and the rugged terrain complicated any attempts to bring up reinforcements quickly once fighting began. Yet scattered among the American arsenal were weapons that had never been intended for the role they were about to assume. The 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun had been designed with a singular purpose in mind: shooting down high-altitude German bombers threatening American skies. These imposing weapons featured lengthy barrels, exceptional muzzle velocity, and sophisticated fire control systems that made them among the finest anti-aircraft pieces the Allies possessed. German tank crews rolling toward the front had no expectation whatsoever that these guns would soon be firing directly at them across snow-covered fields and narrow forest roads. Still, a handful of American officers recognized that desperate circumstances demanded unconventional solutions. They began the difficult work of repositioning 90mm guns away from their static anti-aircraft emplacements, moving them into carefully concealed ambush positions that covered the routes German armour would most likely follow. This represented improvisation driven purely by necessity, the kind of battlefield adaptation that would soon tip the scales in ways neither side had anticipated. The Ardennes transformed into a testing ground where military doctrine, engineering specifications, and human courage collided with violent consequences. The Germans advanced with confidence born from their armoured superiority and their assumption that American forces would be paralysed by the sudden onslaught. They were about to learn that American artillery crews possessed far greater flexibility and adaptability than German intelligence had given them credit for. Snow continued falling steadily, deadening the sounds of movement across the landscape, while young American gunners worked with frozen fingers to sight along gun barrels originally designed to track aircraft through the sky, but now trained on the shadowy tree line where enemy armour was expected to emerge at any moment. Everything was in place for a confrontation that defied conventional expectations. Anti-aircraft guns would face off against armoured behemoths in a contest neither side had properly prepared for. For German commanders, The Ardennes assault represented perhaps the final opportunity to seize strategic initiative on the Western Front and stave off the inevitable. For the Americans, it became an examination of their ability to endure, to innovate under pressure, and to transform unlikely tools into effective weapons. The 90mm gun, an instrument crafted for air defense, was about to earn recognition in the annals of ground combat history that no one could have predicted. The development history of the 90mm M1 gun contained no provisions for dueling with German tanks in Belgian forests. American designers working in the late 1930s had focused their efforts on creating a weapon system capable of engaging high-altitude bombers like the German Heinkel He 111 or the Junkers Ju-88 that dominated early war aerial doctrine. By 1941, the gun had demonstrated its worth as a formidable anti-aircraft platform, achieving muzzle velocities exceeding 800 meters per second and capable of hurling a 15-kilogram shell to altitudes above 30,000 feet. Crews became highly proficient with sophisticated prediction equipment and radar-guided fire control mechanisms, establishing the weapon as a cornerstone of America's homeland air defense network. As the war expanded into Europe, 90mm guns accompanied American divisions across the Atlantic. Though portable in theory, the weapon was far from light, requiring substantial prime movers for relocation and typically appearing near supply depots, port facilities, and critical road junctions where protection against Luftwaffe raids remained essential. Few commanders entertained thoughts of deploying it against ground targets, yet careful examination of its characteristics revealed potential that went unexploited for years. The extended barrel and high-velocity projectiles promised armor penetration capabilities far superior to the standard 75mm gun mounted on most American tanks, or even the more advanced 76mm weapon that equipped later Sherman variants. When crews tested the gun with armor-piercing ammunition, trials demonstrated penetration exceeding 120 millimeters of steel plate at ranges of 1,000 meters, performance approaching the protection levels of German Panthers. Before the Battle of the Bulge erupted, isolated American units had already conducted limited experiments with ground rolls for the weapon. During operations in Italy throughout 1943 and into 1944, occasional batteries fired against fortified bunkers or employed indirect fire against entrenched German positions with devastating effect. In France, following the Normandy invasion, scattered reports circulated describing 90mm fire directed at German strongpoints. Despite these instances, no formal doctrine supported such employment, and nobody anticipated it would become a decisive factor in armoured warfare. German intelligence remained aware of the gun's existence, but dismissed it primarily as an anti-aircraft threat, requiring no special countermeasures from ground forces. Their attention focused on countering the omnipresent Sherman tank and British anti-tank guns like the 6-pounder and the fearsome 17-pounder. German planners assumed that whenever American forces deployed heavy anti-tank firepower, it would arrive in the form of dedicated tank destroyers like the M10 or the newer M36 Jackson, the latter mounting the same 90mm gun but integrated into a mobile armoured vehicle. What completely escaped their consideration was the possibility that Americans might employ the towed anti-aircraft pieces themselves in direct fire roles, often dug into positions behind road embankments or stationed at critical crossroads where German armour had no choice but to advance directly into their fields of fire. In the Ardennes, as chaos erupted across the front, the presence of these guns proved extraordinarily fortunate. Many had been positioned near logistical centres, precisely the locations German spearheads aimed to capture or destroy. American commanders seized this opportunity with both hands. Batteries received hasty orders to reorient their weapons. Fire control crews stripped away complex equipment to allow for simpler direct aiming, and armour-piercing ammunition came rushing forward from depots that had stockpiled it without expecting urgent demand. Though cumbersome to transport through snow and mud, once a 90mm gun was properly emplaced, it dominated extended fields of fire with devastating authority. Crews trained to hit fast-moving aircraft discovered that the relatively slow-moving silhouettes of tanks presented easier targets, especially at ranges where most German gunners felt completely secure from American fire. The technical advantages of the 90mm extended beyond raw power to encompass remarkable versatility. With respectable rates of fire and shells that could be fitted with time fuses for airburst effects, the weapon remained deadly against infantry formations as well as armour. In the winter landscape of Belgium, a single battery could hold a village or control a vital crossroads, delivering both precision anti-tank fire and area bombardment against advancing infantry. American troops who had harboured serious doubts about their chances against Panthers and Tigers suddenly discovered that with proper support, even the most heavily armoured German vehicles could be destroyed. This revelation spread rapidly through the ranks, providing a critical psychological boost during the darkest days of the German offensive when defeat seemed possible. When the German counter-offensive erupted with full fury, the weight of its striking power rested squarely upon its armoured spearheads. The Wehrmacht had concentrated some of the most formidable tanks ever deployed in European combat, machines that embodied both German engineering excellence and the desperate hope that technological superiority might somehow reverse the war's momentum. At the core of these armoured columns rolled the Panther medium tank and the Tiger II, commonly designated the King Tiger by Allied intelligence. Each represented a level of firepower and protection that American and British soldiers had learned to fear since first encountering them during the Normandy campaign. The Panther, mounting its 75mm KWK 42 L70 gun, had earned a fearsome reputation for accuracy and penetrating power at extended ranges. Its sloped armour configuration provided protection equivalent to much thicker vertical plates, rendering frontal assaults by standard Sherman tanks virtually suicidal for American crews. The Tiger II presented an even more terrifying prospect, a vehicle weighing nearly 70 tons and shielded by frontal armour up to 150mm thick. Its 88mm KWK 43 cannon could annihilate Allied tanks at distances exceeding 2 kilometres, often before American guns could even achieve effective range. German crews, frequently veterans transferred from the brutal Eastern Front campaigns, carried profound confidence in their machines. They anticipated the Ardennes offensive would replicate the spectacular successes of 1940 when German armour swept through France with minimal opposition, shattering Allied armies before they could organise coherent resistance. Supporting these massive tanks were units equipped with the reliable Panzer IV, still numerous and effective despite its age, alongside assault guns like the Stu G3 and Jagdpanzer IV. Combined into powerful armoured wedges, these formations were designed to smash through thinly held American positions, seize key road junctions that controlled movement through the region, and unravel Allied logistics before reserves could respond. The terrain, though heavily wooded and hilly, offered a network of narrow roads funneling toward objectives like Saint-Vith, Bastogne, and ultimately the Meuse River crossings. German planners convinced themselves that if armoured columns advanced with sufficient speed, Allied reinforcements would arrive too late to prevent disaster. The psychological impact of this armoured concentration proved immense even before the first shots were fired. Reports from American infantry described feeling the ground tremble as German columns approached their positions. Belgian civilians in occupied villages watched convoys of Panthers stretching for miles, their engines producing a menacing growl that carried through the snow-muffled landscape. To many defenders, the sight of a King Tiger emerging from morning mist represented a waking nightmare. Machines seemingly impervious to anything in the American arsenal short of concentrated artillery barrages or airstrikes that weather conditions often prevented. Allied intelligence had provided warnings about heavy armour concentrations, but the sheer scale of the armoured build-up surpassed even pessimistic estimates. German doctrine emphasised shock effect and rapid penetration. The Ardennes plan envisioned panzer divisions breaking through quickly, encircling American forces in pockets and racing westward before Allied air power could respond once weather cleared. Fuel shortages were acknowledged in planning but casually dismissed. The Nazi leader himself believed captured Allied fuel depots would provide whatever the panzer columns required to maintain momentum. This overconfidence seemed justified during the first days when American positions were overrun, prisoners captured in large numbers, and German tanks surged forward into territory the Allies had considered secure. What German commanders fundamentally underestimated was the resilience of the defenders and the extraordinary adaptability of American artillery doctrine. They had calculated that only dedicated tank destroyers or massed heavy artillery could effectively challenge their armour. The concept that anti-aircraft guns, emplaced at crossroads, concealed along tree lines, or frantically dragged into firing positions by exhausted crews, might transform into effective tank killers had simply not entered their operational planning. German tankers, protected by steel and buoyed by memories of past victories, advanced with a confidence that would soon encounter deadly surprises. As snow fell heavily and roads became clogged with traffic, the German spearheads grew vulnerable in ways their planners had not anticipated. Extended columns slowed to a crawl, visibility dropped to dangerous levels, and manoeuvring became increasingly difficult in confined spaces. At precisely these natural choke points, American guns waited in concealment, some of them the unexpected 90mm weapons, silent for the moment but primed to unleash devastation once Panthers and Tigers crept within effective range. In the confusion following the German breakthrough, American officers confronted grim choices without the luxury of time for deliberation. Standard defensive doctrine had not prepared them for sudden armoured thrusts through terrain considered unsuitable for major operations, yet battlefield necessity has always been the mother of innovation. With conventional anti-tank guns like the 57mm and 75mm proving largely ineffective against Panther and Tiger armour at combat ranges, desperate measures became essential. Commanders began pulling 90mm M1 anti-aircraft guns from their prepared emplacements and redirecting them toward the advancing tanks, a decision that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of the entire battle. The process was anything but straightforward or simple. These guns weighed nearly 9 tons, including their carriages, and required heavy trucks or tracked prime movers for repositioning across any significant distance. Snow-choked roads, abandoned vehicles, and battle wreckage made transport painfully slow and extremely dangerous. Nevertheless, gun crews, often trained exclusively for high-altitude aerial engagements, displayed remarkable adaptability under pressure. In some instances, units stripped away complicated fire control systems to reduce overall weight and allow quicker manual aiming. Others dug the mounts directly into frozen ground, creating stable firing platforms at road junctions or on village outskirts where fields of fire could be maximized. Ammunition handlers rushed armor-piercing shells forward, often scavenging from rear area depots that had never expected such urgent combat demand. Field improvisation extended well beyond the hardware itself. Infantry and engineer units collaborated to conceal gun positions using snow and available foliage, creating deadly ambush sites that German reconnaissance failed to identify. Crews accustomed to calculating complex lead angles for fast-moving bombers discovered that aiming at tanks advancing through narrow lanes was less abstract and far more visceral. Instead of tracking targets across open sky, they sighted through forests at hulking silhouettes approaching head-on at predictable speeds. The training discipline carried over remarkably well. Gunners applied the same precision, timing, and composure under pressure they had mastered while engaging aircraft moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour. One particularly striking example of this adaptation came from units supporting the 2nd Armoured Division as it moved to counter German penetrations. As enemy forces pushed toward key Belgian villages, officers ordered 90mm batteries to cover exposed flanks where Sherman tanks alone could not hold against superior German armour. The guns were emplaced at crossroads and hidden behind stone walls characteristic of the region, waiting in absolute silence until German armour approached within 1,000 metres. At that range, the velocity of the 90mm armor-piercing round gave it sufficient energy to pierce even the thick frontal armor of Panthers. Reports from these early engagements described shells punching cleanly through turrets, igniting fuel and ammunition, forcing German tank crews to abandon their vehicles in panic. Integration with existing forces created a layered defense more effective than the sum of its parts. Tank destroyers like the M36 Jackson also carried the 90mm gun, but there were never sufficient numbers of them to cover the broad defensive front adequately. Towed versions of the gun, despite their logistical difficulties and vulnerability, filled critical gaps in the defensive line. What emerged through this crisis was a patchwork of resistance built on ingenuity and sheer determination. American commanders did not rely solely on established doctrine. They trusted the initiative of local officers and non-commissioned officers to position these guns where they could make the greatest difference. At crossroads like Baraque de Fréture, at small villages surrounding Bastogne, and along the approaches to Saint-Vith, 90mm crews stood alongside infantrymen, creating ad hoc defensive positions that disrupted the carefully planned German timetable. Each destroyed tank slowed the overall advance, buying precious hours for reserves to mobilize and move forward from rear areas. By transforming a weapon of air defense into an effective tank killer, the Americans demonstrated the kind of flexibility that German planners had failed to anticipate or account for in their operational calculations. Improvisation became the key to survival, and survival gradually shifted into resistance strong enough to blunt the armoured thrusts that were supposed to guarantee swift victory. The first actual clashes where 90mm guns engaged German armour produced moments of profound shock that rippled through both armies. On December 17th and 18th, when the offensive still possessed full momentum, German tank columns pushing along the narrow Ardennes roads encountered ambushes unlike any they had experienced in previous campaigns. Expecting only Sherman tanks, or perhaps the lighter American anti-tank guns they had learned to dismiss, they were stunned to find their vaunted Panthers and Tiger IIs erupting in flames after single, well-placed hits. Accounts from German survivors tell this story with vivid clarity. Near the villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, settlements caught directly in the path of the 12th SS Panzer Division, American gunners had emplaced 90mm pieces behind rubble and hedgerows that characterized the local terrain. As German armor attempted to force passage through these villages, the guns opened fire at ranges between 700 and 900 meters. Shells struck the sides of Panthers, penetrating their sloped armor, while others punched through frontal glacis plates at closer distances when tanks were forced to navigate around obstacles. Infantry supporting the tanks suddenly found themselves completely exposed, diving for whatever cover they could find as burning wrecks blocked the roads. German officers who had promised their men an unstoppable advance confronted the horrifying reality that American firepower possessed unexpected capabilities. Similar scenes unfolded near Saint-Vith, where armoured spearheads from the 5th Panzer Army collided with hastily reinforced American defences, incorporating 90mm guns. One battery reported destroying half a dozen tanks in a single engagement spanning less than an hour, forcing survivors to withdraw and regroup before attempting another approach. German tank crews, who had trained themselves to shrug off hits from lighter Allied weapons, began to realize that lingering in exposed positions carried mortal risk. Some resorted to smoke screens and preparatory artillery barrages to cover their movements. But even these tactics could not completely shield them from the accurate high-velocity fire of the American guns positioned in depth. For the American defenders, these encounters delivered a desperately needed morale boost at a moment when many units felt overwhelmed. Soldiers who had felt helpless against the imposing silhouettes of Tigers and Panthers now witnessed these supposedly invincible machines destroyed before their eyes. Infantrymen huddled in frozen foxholes or manning improvised roadblocks reported cheering as massive German tanks ground to a halt, their turrets blown open or crews bailing out into the snow to escape burning vehicles. The realization spread quickly through the American ranks that with these guns deployed effectively, Even the heaviest German armour could be stopped decisively. The psychological effect on German units proved equally significant and deeply troubling to their command structure. Rumours circulated among tank crews that the Americans had secretly introduced new superweapons, perhaps experimental designs rushed into combat from hidden development programs. Some believed the guns were British 17-pounders somehow transferred to American units, while others speculated about prototype weapons based on captured German technology. In reality, they were simply standard American weapons adapted to new roles, but the aura of surprise and uncertainty magnified their tactical impact far beyond their actual numbers. Tank commanders who had been confident of breaking through lightly armed American lines began advancing more cautiously, sacrificing the speed and momentum that the entire Ardennes plan desperately depended upon for success. The battlefield evidence became undeniable as the offensive progressed. Roads littered with wrecked German armour, some vehicles still smouldering beneath falling snow, told a story that could not be dismissed or explained away. American engineers sometimes utilized these burned-out hulks as improvised barricades, further slowing enemy columns attempting to bypass the obstacles. German prisoners captured in subsequent days admitted their astonishment during interrogations, explaining that they had never expected to encounter such effective ground fire from units they believed were dedicated exclusively to anti-aircraft roles. What had begun as a desperate improvisation, born of necessity, quickly became a recognized method of defense, replicated wherever 90mm guns could be deployed with adequate fields of fire. These first shocks, administered to German confidence in the snow-covered Ardennes, marked a genuine turning point in the battle's trajectory. They did not halt the offensive outright or immediately reverse German gains, but they demonstrated conclusively to both sides that the Panzer spearheads were not the invincible force that propaganda and past victories suggested. The myth of unstoppable German armour cracked under the pressure of American adaptability and resourcefulness, and every subsequent clash carried with it the memory of those early engagements where the defender's unexpected weapon had proven decisive beyond all reasonable expectation. As the battle raged deeper into December with increasing ferocity, the Ardennes transformed into a contest of endurance rather than the swift, decisive campaign Germany had envisioned. The German plan had depended entirely on rapid advances and breakthrough, yet stubborn resistance at key geographic points transformed ordinary villages and minor crossroads into anchors of defence that held entire sectors together. Bastogne, St. Vith, and smaller hamlets scattered across the snow-covered forest became names etched into military history precisely because American units held them long enough to completely disrupt the German operational timetable. In this grinding struggle for time and space, the 90mm guns played a crucial role in stiffening defensive lines where armoured support remained dangerously thin or absent entirely. The 7th Armoured Division, assigned the mission of defending the approaches to St. Vith, found itself repeatedly under assault by elements of the 5th Panzer Army attempting to seize this vital communications hub. With terrain bottlenecks forcing German armour into narrow, predictable avenues of approach, American commanders deployed 90mm batteries to cover likely attack routes with interlocking fields of fire. Contemporary reports from the period highlight how these guns, emplaced on commanding ridges or positioned behind road embankments that provided both protection and concealment, destroyed multiple vehicles before German forces could effectively react or withdraw. At St. Vith itself, delaying actions brought nearly a full week of resistance, denying the Germans a road junction whose capture was essential to their entire operational concept. Each day gained through this stubborn defence allowed reinforcements from both north and south to converge on the penetration, gradually tightening the noose around the German salient. At Bastogne, famously defended by the 101st Airborne Division, 90mm guns also contributed significantly to the successful defence. Though the town is remembered primarily for paratroopers holding their positions under siege, the surrounding artillery units provided absolutely critical anti-armour firepower that prevented German tanks from simply overwhelming the defenders through brute force. Batteries were dug into frozen fields surrounding the town, concealed by fresh snowfall, and tasked with covering open approaches where German armour would be most vulnerable. When German tanks attempted to complete the encirclement of the town, these guns hammered them at long range with devastating accuracy. Accounts from paratroopers describe cheering as shells from the big guns tore into approaching armour, halting attacks that otherwise might have broken through the defensive perimeter and captured the town. The siege of Bastogne became legendary, but the contribution of heavy anti-aircraft guns firing in ground rolls deserves recognition alongside the courage of the surrounded infantry. Elsewhere across the front, the 2nd Armoured Division employed 90mm fire to plug gaps created by retreating or overrun infantry units. In villages like Selles and Hotten, the guns helped repel German assaults threatening to outflank American positions and penetrate even deeper into Allied rear areas. The presence of such heavy weapons, though limited in absolute numbers, magnified the effective strength of thinly stretched units far beyond what their actual manpower would suggest. A single battery properly sited and well supplied with ammunition could command an entire valley or control a critical road network, forcing the Germans to either commit overwhelming force to eliminate it or find alternate routes through even more difficult terrain. These delays proved fatal to the tight German timetable that allowed no margin for error or prolonged engagements. Holding defensive lines was not simply a matter of deploying superior firepower in isolated positions. Success required careful coordination between artillery, infantry, and engineer units to ensure that 90mm guns worked in concert with mines, bazooka teams, and the remaining operational Sherman tanks. In many defensive sectors, a sophisticated layered defense emerged through trial and error. Light weapons slowed German advances and channeled them into predictable patterns, forcing armour into constricted paths where the larger guns waited in ambush. This integration of diverse resources demonstrated a growing maturity in American combined arms tactics, showing how improvisation under extreme pressure could evolve into coherent defensive systems that leveraged every available asset. The harsh weather conditions further amplified the effectiveness of well-positioned guns. Poor visibility and snow-laden forests severely restricted German maneuverability, funneling tank columns into exposed positions where they became vulnerable to concentrated fire. Once a road became clogged with destroyed armour, columns stacked up behind the obstruction created lucrative targets for follow-up attacks. In these critical moments, 90mm crews fired relentlessly, understanding that every tank destroyed not only reduced enemy combat power, but also delayed their ability to reorganize and strike again with fresh forces. By late December, as the offensive reached its maximum penetration, it became evident to observers on both sides that the American defensive line had bent dramatically but had not broken completely. The German drive slowed to a grinding crawl, drained of momentum by constant delays and unexpected resistance. Much of this endurance owed itself to individual units that stood firm in freezing conditions despite being surrounded, outnumbered, or cut off from higher headquarters. But the contribution of the 90mm guns to this defensive success was undeniable to anyone who examined the results objectively. They had transformed scattered strongpoints into genuine bastions capable of withstanding repeated armoured assaults, ensuring that the Germans never achieved the rapid breakthrough that their entire strategic concept required for any hope of success. The cracks appearing in the German offensive plan widened not only because of determined American resistance, but also due to fundamental miscalculations embedded in German intelligence assessments and operational planning. German intelligence services had constructed their assumptions about Allied strength on outdated estimates and incomplete information. Reconnaissance efforts had focused heavily on known Sherman tank production figures and the identified presence of American tank destroyer battalions, but they had failed completely to account for the American tendency to repurpose weapons outside their doctrinally assigned roles. In their careful calculations, the 90mm gun existed primarily on paper as an anti-aircraft piece deployed for homeland defense or protecting rear area installations. The possibility of encountering it as a battlefield obstacle to armoured thrusts had not been seriously considered or war-gamed during planning sessions. This critical underestimation created a false sense of superiority among panzer crews preparing for the offensive. German commanders assured their men repeatedly that only the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun posed a serious threat to heavy armour like the Panther and Tiger. As a direct result, when tank formations advanced into the Ardennes sector, they did so with considerably less caution than circumstances warranted. Intelligence reports indicate that German formations often charged directly down narrow roads and forest trails, confident that only mines or massed artillery concentrations could significantly hinder their progress. That confidence evaporated rapidly when burning tank hulks began appearing in the snow, victims of the very weapon German intelligence had completely overlooked in their threat assessments. Logistical weaknesses already present in the German plan compounded this intelligence error with devastating effect. The offensive had always been a desperate gamble, relying on precise adherence to timetables and the optimistic assumption that captured Allied fuel stocks would sustain the advance. Every unexpected delay meant fuel consumption spiraled out of control as vehicles idled or maneuvered repeatedly. The 90mm guns, by destroying tanks at critical choke points and blocking narrow roads, inadvertently worsened German supply problems far beyond their direct combat effect. Columns stalled behind destroyed vehicles burned precious gasoline while idling, and recovery vehicles capable of clearing wrecks were in desperately short supply and frequently exposed to continued ambush when they attempted to work. German diaries and letters recovered after the battle reveal mounting frustration among both officers and enlisted men. Tank commanders lamented being trapped in frozen roads, surrounded by destroyed vehicles from earlier attacks, unable to advance forward or retreat effectively without exposing themselves to further fire. The psychological damage inflicted by these miscalculations extended well beyond the immediate tank crews suffering losses. Infantry units assigned to support armoured advances grew increasingly reluctant to press forward aggressively when the supposedly invincible spearhead suffered sudden, inexplicable losses. Commanders at all levels had promised their troops overwhelming momentum and swift victory, yet by late December the offensive had slowed into grinding attrition warfare reminiscent of the Eastern Front. Soldiers began questioning the repeated assurances that final victory remained imminent, especially when once feared Tigers and Panthers were discovered abandoned by their crews, their armour pierced by weapons many Germans had never encountered or even heard of before. Strategically, the Nazi leaders' insistence on absolute secrecy and rigidly centralized control severely exacerbated these problems. Senior officers who might have adjusted tactics in response to emerging American defensive capabilities often lacked accurate, timely reports from frontline units. Communication breakdowns and the fog of war left battalions repeating the same tactical mistakes, sending armour repeatedly into ambush zones where 90mm batteries waited patiently for targets to enter their carefully plotted kill zones. At the operational level, this translated directly into wasted manpower and irreplaceable armoured vehicles that the German army could ill afford to lose during the winter of 1944, when industrial production had been devastated by Allied bombing. American adaptability and tactical flexibility contrasted starkly with German rigidity and adherence to predetermined plans. While German doctrine emphasized concentrated armoured thrusts along narrow corridors, the Americans quickly learned to disperse their defensive firepower and reposition guns rapidly based on developing situations. By the time German tank commanders fully recognized the serious threat posed by 90mm guns in ground rolls, the defensive pattern was already firmly established across the entire front. Defensive belts incorporating these weapons at multiple depths had solidified, and the opportunity for a clean breakthrough had vanished completely. The intelligence failure regarding American artillery versatility joined a long list of critical errors plaguing the Ardennes offensive from its conception. Excessive reliance on poor weather to ground Allied aircraft, serious underestimation of Allied logistical capabilities and reserve depth, a naive belief that surprise alone could compensate for chronic shortages in fuel and ammunition all contributed to failure. Yet the complete oversight regarding 90mm guns symbolized the broader strategic problem facing Germany by late 1944. German planners had assumed their opponents would remain rigidly predictable, bound by doctrine and lacking initiative. Instead, the Americans demonstrated a remarkable ability to innovate rapidly on the battlefield itself, turning what should have been a critical liability into one of the most decisive tactical advantages of the entire campaign. When snow finally settled across the Ardennes in January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed utterly, leaving behind a shattered landscape strewn with destroyed tanks, abandoned vehicles, frozen corpses, and thousands of casualties from both sides. For the United States Army conducting after-action analysis, one of the most enduring lessons emerging from the battle was the completely unanticipated versatility of the 90mm gun. Originally developed as an anti-aircraft system for homeland defense, its combat performance during the Bulge demonstrated conclusively that heavy-caliber, high-velocity weapons could decisively alter the course of armored engagements when commanders employed them creatively and aggressively. The statistical aftermath revealed stark, undeniable numbers. German forces lost nearly 600 tanks and assault guns during the operation, with many of them destroyed in direct clashes where 90mm fire played either a primary or supporting role. Detailed after-action reports compiled by United States Army Ordnance officers emphasized that the weapon had successfully penetrated even the thick frontal armor of Panther tanks and occasionally the dreaded Tiger II under favorable engagement conditions. For frontline soldiers who had previously believed only Allied air power or massed artillery could effectively halt German heavy armor, this represented a genuine revelation that reshaped their understanding of combined arms warfare. The influence of these combat results extended far beyond immediate battlefield morale. Within months of the battle's conclusion, the American military began fundamentally rethinking its entire approach to anti-tank warfare and armored vehicle development. The demonstrated success of the 90mm gun in Belgium validated decisions already made to mount it permanently on specialized armored vehicles such as the M36 Jackson tank destroyer and later the M26 Pershing heavy tank. When the Pershing made its combat debut in early 1945 during the final push into Germany, it carried a 90mm main gun derived directly from the same system that had proven itself so devastatingly effective in the Ardennes forests. This transition marked a fundamental shift in United States armored doctrine, moving decisively away from reliance on medium-caliber weapons like the 75mm and 76mm guns toward matching or directly surpassing German firepower across the board. The Germans also took careful notice of these developments, though far too late to affect the war's outcome. Interrogations of prisoners and examination of captured documents indicated that German commanders were genuinely surprised at how effectively the Americans had improvised defensive solutions. They admitted candidly that the unexpected presence of heavy anti-tank firepower had seriously eroded the confidence of panzer units and disrupted operational momentum at critical moments. For a military establishment that had long prided itself on tactical and technical innovation, epitomized by their own pioneering use of the 88mm gun in dual anti-aircraft and anti-tank roles, this represented a particularly ironic reversal of fortunes. By late 1944, it was the Americans who had successfully seized the mantle of battlefield adaptability and practical innovation. Beyond purely technical lessons about weapons performance, the legacy of the 90mm gun at the Bulge highlighted a broader strategic theme that would influence post-war military thinking. Industrial flexibility combined with soldier ingenuity and decentralized decision-making could effectively outmatch even the most sophisticated enemy designs when properly leveraged. American gunners, frequently operating in brutally freezing conditions with minimal rest and under constant threat, had proven that the right weapon employed decisively at the critical moment could blunt an offensive that sought to fundamentally change the war's entire outcome. Their actions delayed German spearheads long enough for Allied reinforcements to arrive in strength, and in doing so helped secure the eventual encirclement and comprehensive defeat of the Nazi regime's final desperate gamble in the West. In the post-war years, stretching into the 1950s, the reputation and influence of the 90mm gun only grew within military circles. It became the standard main armament on American heavy tanks throughout the decade, directly influencing NATO armored doctrine and the weapon systems that Allied nations developed to counter potential Soviet armor. Lessons learned in the frozen Ardennes shaped training manuals and tactical publications for years afterward, emphasizing the critical principle that no weapon system should ever be artificially restricted to a single role if battlefield circumstances demanded otherwise. Veterans who had served on 90mm gun crews during the battle recalled the Ardennes experience as definitive proof that tactical adaptability and willingness to innovate could decide battles as decisively as numerical superiority or technological advantage. The story of the 90mm gun at the Battle of the Bulge thus represents far more than an isolated tactical episode or interesting historical footnote. It stands as an enduring testament to the fundamentally unpredictable nature of warfare, where weapons meticulously designed for one specific purpose can unexpectedly come to define victory in an entirely different role that designers never imagined. For the Germans, it served as a painful reminder that underestimating an opponent's resourcefulness and capacity for innovation could prove absolutely fatal to even the most carefully crafted operational plans. For the Allies, it provided compelling evidence that resilience, practical innovation, and stubborn determination could successfully withstand even the fiercest armoured assaults that a desperate Reich could still muster in its final months of existence. The weapon that had been built to defend American skies against German bombers instead helped break the back of Germany's last major offensive in the West, writing an unexpected chapter in the history of armoured warfare that military historians continue studying decades later.